to recording. I'm going to consent to that. And with that, I'd love to introduce our speaker, whom we are very fortunate to have with us, Chad Hanson. Chad is a research ecologist and the director of the John Muir Project of Earth Island Institute, located in Big Bear City, California. Dr. Hanson has a PhD in ecology from the University of California at Davis, with the research focus on fire ecology in conifer forest ecosystems. And he's the author of the 2021 book, Smokescreen: Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. He's also the co-editor and co-author of the 2015 book, The Ecological Importance of Mixed Severity Fires, Nature's Phoenix. He has published dozens of scientific studies and articles in peer-reviewed journals pertaining to forest fire ecology and climate change. Research by Dr. Hanson covers topics such as natural post-fire forest regrowth and carbon sequestration, carbon flux in wildland fires, current forest fire patterns and trends, fire history, habitat selection of rare wildlife species associated with habitat created by high intensity fire, and adverse impacts to wildlife caused by logging. He became involved in forest conservation work after hiking the entire length of the Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico to Canada in 1989 with his older brother, and seeing firsthand the devastation to forests caused by commercial logging program on federal public lands in the US. The New York Times in 2017 described Dr. Hanson as being on, quote, the cutting edge of ecological research, close quote. Dr. Hanson regularly authors opinion editorial articles that are published in national newspapers, including the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and Washington Post. So we have a wonderful authority to learn from this evening. So Chad, thank you so much for lending us your knowledge and taking the time to join us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for the invitation to come talk to you. All right, so I am going to share my screen, and hopefully that will work out just wonderfully. All right, can everyone see my screen just fine?
Yep.
All right, good deal. All right, well, thank you so much. Again, I'm Chad Hanson, forest and fire ecologist with the John Muir Project, and I'm going to be talking to you tonight about a lot of myths and misconceptions about wildfires, and how those myths and misconceptions are getting in the way of us doing better for our forests and for our communities, as well as for the climate. And so I'm going to give a little bit of background, but first, again, as was mentioned in the gracious introduction, I'm the author of the recent book, Smokescreen: Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. It came out last year. And if folks want a lot more information about all these things, you can certainly get a copy on Amazon or bookshop.com. And I wrote it for non-scientists. I've got hundreds of scientific studies cited in the endnotes, but I specifically wrote this to really try to translate the science for non-scientists, and also use a lot of personal anecdotes to connect the dots and underscore key points. So as mentioned, I got into forest conservation work in 1989. My older brother and I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico to Canada. We left on April 20th, 1989, and reached Canada on September 24th, 1989. And this is us at the Mexican border on April 20th of 89, looking very, very naive. We had really no idea, of course, what was ahead of us and how difficult it would be. And this is us 3 days from the Canadian border. I lost probably 30 pounds over the course of the trip. I was about 162 pounds here, which is not a great weight for me. obviously looking much less well clean cut. But along the trail, we, especially as we got into the northern Sierra Nevada and then, into the national forests of Oregon and Washington, even more so, we saw the devastation caused by logging on national forests. And I really was shocked. I had no idea that was happening on national forests at that time. I naively thought they were protected like national parks. And so I became involved as soon as I got back to Los Angeles, where I was living at that time. I became involved in forest conservation work shortly thereafter. I joined the Sierra Club, and I've been an active Sierra Club member and leader ever since. All right, so I'm going to talk about first, one of the key myths, and one of the ones that we really need to understand and avoid to keep our communities safe from wildfire. And that's the myth of managing vegetation out in wildlands under the rubric, or I would say more appropriately under the guise of fuel reduction. And trying to do that, or claiming that you're doing that as a community protection strategy. This whole idea that we're gonna thin forests, and whatever that means. We're gonna thin forests out in the remote wildlands. We're going to create fuel breaks. We're gonna masticate chaparral, and somehow that'll stop the fires from reaching the towns. That's the narrative that the public is being sold right now by state governments in the West, including California, by the federal government right now. And so I want to talk about that because literally lives hang in the balance. So what the science is telling us loudly and clearly is that there is only one effective way to protect homes from wildland fire. And that is to focus on the homes themselves in terms of what we call home hardening. And that means fire-resistant roofing, sweeping dry pine needles and leaves off the roof every fire season. Key things like ember-proof vents. Replace those old coarse wire mesh attic vents with a modern fine wire mesh ember-proof vent, so the embers won't get blown by the winds through those wire vents and end up in your attic and cause an ignition. That's actually how most homes burn in a wildfire. They're already in flames by the time the wildland fire even reaches the town, because the embers are landing by the thousands, driven by the winds a mile or two in advance of the flames. And so ember-proof vents will, a few $100s in most cases will make the difference, but it's not the only thing, but it's a really important thing. Simple things like rain gutter guards to keep the dry leaves and pine needles from accumulating in the rain gutters, because what can happen is those embers can land on the roof, roll down into dry leaves and pine needles, cause an ignition and ignite the roof. So that's all home hardening, and that's really key. That's the number one thing. The second thing, which goes hand in hand with home hardening, is what we call defensible space. And it's not about cutting down mature trees. You really don't want to do that. You want the shade from the trees, but it's about removing dry grasses near the home, seedlings, dry leaves and twigs on the forest floor, removing lower limbs on mature trees, making sure limbs don't touch roof lines or decks. That defensible space is critically important, and it's really effective out to about 60 feet or as much as 100 feet around the home itself, each home. And so it's a very narrow zone. Beyond 100 feet from homes, there is no additional benefit in terms of home protection from any kind of vegetation management. So anything that's done out in the wildlands in the name of community protection or fuel breaks, fire breaks, it's not doing anything to protect homes or communities. It's all about the home itself and 100 feet around the home. And that is such a key concept for I think, communities to understand. Now, we have seen tragically what happens when we do it the wrong way. And the wrong way, unfortunately, is the dominant approach that we are still, as a society, pursuing. Unfortunately, both Democrats and Republicans. And we saw the tragic results of that in the 2018 Camp Fire, which devastated the town of Paradise. The first 6 hours of that fire, between the point of origin and reaching the town of Paradise, the campfire burned through several thousand acres that were among the most heavily logged forests in the entire northern Sierra Nevada. Extensive areas of commercial thinning, post-fire logging on both public and private lands done under the guise of fuel reduction. And the communities, Paradise, Concow, and Magalia, they were told years before, they were told that these logging projects were fuel reduction, they were fire breaks, and that the logging companies and the Forest Service were removing fuel from the forest by removing these trees, and that would basically slow and stop the fires so that fire suppression forces could easily put them out, and it would stop the fires from reaching the towns. People believed that, and as a result, they had a false sense of security, a very dangerous false sense of security. They thought, I don't need to do my defensible space pruning. I don't need to put on ember-proof vents or put on rain gutter guards, because these fuel breaks out in the wildlands, miles from the town, they're somehow going to protect us. And what happened is the campfire burned the fastest and most intensely through those several thousand acres by far than any other place in the entire fire. And it reached the town hours earlier than it otherwise would have because it moved so fast. 86 people lost their lives and over 14,000 homes were burned. And the thing is that was preventable. We have seen these tragedies, and we know the data are solid on this. We have study after study telling us that if the defensible space and home hardening work is done, and if the communities that need the financial assistance are provided with the resources to do that, because not everyone can afford to do it. And I think we need to provide that. If that work is done, and if we have assistance for evacuations and evacuation planning, what we are seeing is over 99% of homes are surviving wildland fires, even very fast-moving, intense wildland fires, and people and their animals get out safely. So if we focus on communities, we can save homes and we can save lives. Now, we also saw a similar circumstance. Fortunately, the results weren't as tragic, but they weren't great. They were still serious community impacts from the Caldor fire that happened last summer. This was in the northern Sierra Nevada. And these yellow and orange areas that you see there, those are all logged areas. Most of that is commercial thinning, mostly on national forests. This is the El Dorado National Forest. And so you can see thousands upon thousands of acres were commercially thinned, vast acreages. And these areas, the fire burned through at some of its most rapid rates. Most of that burned very intensely, mostly a moderate and high intensity fire in these thinned areas, very much contrary to the myth that the public is told that somehow if you do these so-called thinning projects, that the fire will burn at low intensity and the fire suppression forces can stop the fire. Nothing could be further from the truth. The fires are burning very rapidly through these thinned areas. They're burning often very intensely through these thinned areas. And on the whole western side of the fire, you can see there the little town of Grizzly Flats, and you can see on the map there thousands of acres of thinning all around the town of Grizzly Flats. And thinning, of course, is just a type of logging. It's not what people think it is. The fire burned most intensely through that whole area where most of the thinning was, and most of Grizzly Flats is gone now. Again, that was preventable if we had done it differently. Now, on the other side of the fire, in the Tahoe Basin, the community, for one, is much more affluent, and second, they were responding to an earlier fire, and they got serious about home hardening and defensible space, and they had done that work. They had done the defensible space out a couple hundred feet from homes and home hardening, and the fire stopped in every case at that boundary. It came into it and it stopped, and it did not reach homes. And it was a wonderful success story, but it had nothing to do with logging. It had nothing to do with so-called thinning projects out in the wildlands. It was immediately adjacent to homes and the homes themselves. And so that's where we need to focus. We saw the same thing in the Dixie Fire, 960,000 acre fire that burned last year in the northern Sierra Nevada, further north. And these yellow and orange areas, once again, that's logging. That's mostly thinning. Some of that's clear cutting on private lands, but the largest areas of orange, the two different shades of orange and yellow, those are commercial thinning areas. And much of that burned at high intensity. And it certainly didn't stop the fires. The fastest day of spread, in fact, was through that area just west of Lake Almanor. That's all commercial thinning, and that's where the fire burned the most intensely and the fastest. It also burned very intensely through thousands of acres that were thinned southwest of the town of Greenville, right in the center of the fire there. It's a town I know well. The fire burned rapidly through that. The town was told that the thinning would save them from fire. It was a fuel break. It would stop the fire. The fire burned very quickly through that thinned area, and it burned down most of Greenville. And most of Greenville is gone now. Again, that was preventable. So we have the success stories. We have example after example, and I have a whole chapter in my book talking about these examples where home hardening and defensible space were practiced rigorously across the community, and where the vast majority of homes survived and people were safe versus the counterexamples. All right, so one of the key myths is this idea that we have to get out there and thin the forest, remove a bunch of trees, supposedly because our forests are overgrown. And because they're overgrown, they're burning too intensely, because of fuel accumulation. This is what we've been told over and over and over again. And the amazing thing is that scientists have been studying this issue to death. Every time we look at this, I've published studies on this, lots of other groups of researchers have published on this too. Every time we look specifically at the question of forest density and fire intensity, what we find is denser forests tend to burn at lower intensities most of the time, not higher intensities. So this whole idea that if there's more biomass in the forest, if you have a denser, mature forest, it'll burn more intensely. That is strongly contradicted by the weight of scientific evidence. This is just one study here. This is Zalden done 2018. And you can see as biomass goes up on that x-axis, you can see that fire intensity goes down. And that's that line right in the middle of the image. Fire intensity generally goes down and then it sort of plateaus. But it stands in stark contrast to the narrative out there that denser forest means higher fire intensity. It usually means the opposite. And I have several other studies cited in the lower left there, but there's lots of others. The list goes on and on. And interestingly and correspondingly, we are told that forests that haven't burned in a very long time are going to burn much more intensely because of fuel accumulation and because they're much denser. And that also is not true. Forests that haven't burned even 75 years or more, or a century or more, there's lots of studies on that. I've published a couple, 3 of them actually now, and many others have too. And the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence finds that the forests that have not burned in many decades burn at equal or lower intensities. My studies found equal intensities. Others find that it burned at lower intensities, like this one. That black bar there it says TSF, that's time since fire. That means more than 75 years since the fire burned. And the black bar is high intensity. That's where the fire burns most intensely. And you can just see there that that black bar is narrower. You have less high intensity fire in the forest that had not burned in over 75 years than you have in the forest that burned 10 to 32 years earlier. Now, why is that? How can that possibly be? Well, it comes down to microclimates. Denser forests with more biomass. On the one hand, yes, they have more theoretically that could burn. On the other hand, people forget about the countervailing factors, about the microclimate. A dense, mature forest has higher canopy cover. And higher canopy cover means that the forest has more cooling shade of that forest canopy cover. And so there's less sunlight reaching the forest floor. Everything in the forest, especially on the ground, stays more moist, more shaded, more cool. The denser stands of trees act as a windbreak that buffers the winds that drive the flames. It actually reduces those wind speeds and can reduce fire intensity. And because the forest floor is not getting as much sunlight, those dry grasses don't tend to accumulate as much because they need a lot of sunlight to those grasses to thrive. And so for a whole host of reasons, forests that are denser, that haven't burned in a long time, that have higher canopy cover, often more trees per acre, those forests tend to burn at equal or lower intensities most of the time. Again, very contrary to the narrative that's out there in the public dialogue, but that's what most of the science is telling us. Now, I'm a co-author of a study we published in the journal Ecosphere back in 2016. It's called Bradley et al. And we did the largest scientific analysis ever conducted on this question. We looked at the entire Western US. We looked at 1,500 fires in the more frequent fire forest types like Ponderosa Pine and mixed conifer, 3 decades of data. And we found that weather and climate factors are dominant. Fires are driven mostly by weather and climate. If you have a drought year, if you have hot, dry, windy conditions in that drought year and you have an ignition, you're going to have a larger fire. And it's not going to matter if you have more vegetation or less vegetation. That might play some role, but it's not going to be the dominant driving factor. The dominant driving factor is going to be hot, dry, windy conditions. And but forest management is a secondary factor that is significant, but it doesn't work the way most people think. What we found is that forests with the fewest environmental protections and the most intensive tree removal have the highest fire intensity. And forests with the least tree removal and the highest level of environmental protection have the lowest fire intensities. And the lowest of all were forests that have no tree removal whatsoever, like wilderness and national parks. And so this was a very strong result, and it's the most comprehensive ever done. But others have found the same thing. This is Cruz et al. 2014. They found that fire is highly variable. It's not like if an area is subjected to commercial thinning in a forest that it's always going to burn at high intensity. It'll burn at a mix, just like everything does. Sometimes it'll burn at lower intensity, which is those bars that go to the left in certain circumstances, and sometimes it's going to burn at higher intensity than other forests, which are those bars going to the right. What they found is that in 4 out of the 7 cases, the thinned forest burned at higher intensity, not lower intensity. And that's a really important thing to understand. I found the same thing in a study I just published about the Creek Fire, which burned 380,000 acres in the southern Sierra Nevada in 2020. And I found that high severity fire percentages were the highest in the forests that had the most intensive logging. Post-fire logging, commercial thinning, those forests had the highest levels of fire intensity, whereas forests with very only small tree thinning, they had lower fire intensity, but the lowest fire intensity of all was in forests that had no management, no post-fire logging, and had previous wildfire, and they just reburned. They actually had the lowest fire intensity. And so commercial thinning and post-fire logging are not reducing fire intensity, it's actually increasing fire intensity in most cases. And it's causing a lot of ecological damage. When people hear the term thinning, what they conjure up in their mind is this notion, this idea of Forest Service managers out there with pruning shears. And they don't realize that commercial thinning is an industrial logging operation. It's a commercial logging operation. The typical thinning project, so-called, kills and removes upwards of 70% of the trees in a given stand, including many mature trees and even old growth trees. And this is just one photograph of what commercial thinning, so-called thinning, looks like. This is a national forest in the Sierra Nevada. This is another photo, commercial thinning on a national forest. You can see there's some trees that are left behind, but most of the biomass of the forest is just gone, certainly in the understory. And one other one I'll address just briefly is this idea that fires are burning more intensely because of dead trees. Dead trees we call snags, or down logs after the dead trees fall, that's somehow driving the fires. We've looked at this very carefully as well, and the overwhelming weight of scientific research finds that dead trees do not increase fire intensity. And some studies are finding that forests with more dead trees and more down logs actually have lower fire intensity, which is what this study found. This is Meigs et al. 2016. And you can see there that with additional years after the trees died, when wildland fires do occur, whether it's 10 years or 20 years, there's even lower fire intensity. And that's pretty much after the dead trees, a lot of them fall. How can that possibly be? Again, it seems counterintuitive on the surface. I also looked at this in my Creek Fire study, and I found the same thing, that forests with more dead trees do not have higher fire intensity. In fact, I found that some of the lowest levels of fire intensity were in forests with some of the higher levels of dead trees. But I just didn't find any relationship whatsoever statistically. I just didn't find any difference at all, no matter how many dead trees there were. And one of the things that seems to be a key factor is the fact that when trees die, the needles and small twigs, they fall and they decay into soil. And after that, there's really not much to carry the flames. And when the dead trees fall, more than acting like fuel, they act like giant sponges, because down logs soak up and retain about 25 times more water than the surrounding soil for equal cubic area. So they're really amazing moisture reservoirs, and that's true even in a significant drought year. And so they can actually have a mitigating effect on wildfire. So I will stop there for the moment and be happy to take any questions before I get into the ecological aspects of wildfire and talk a little bit about that.
Several questions, Chad. First of all, what's the difference between forest thinning by logging companies and prescribed burns like the National Park Service does in Yosemite and Sequoia, and work that indigenous communities do to manage forests? So we've got logging company, quote unquote, thinning, prescribed burns by the Park Service, and indigenous traditional stewardship type
Yeah.
fires.
That's a great question. So, as I mentioned, thinning in nearly every case is just a commercial logging operation. It's just logging. The term thinning, the terms like fuel reduction, this is really just marketing. It's really just, these are just euphemisms for logging. And so that really just needs its own conversation. But as far as fire goes, there's really three categories of fire. And in most of our forests, we actually need all three of them, and we need more of the three in most forests. Because I'll get to this in a little bit, most forests actually have less fire now than we had historically before fire suppression. Unlike certain ecosystems like Southern California's chaparral, where we have too much fire, mostly because of human ignitions. But in forests, we actually have still a deficit of fire, less than we had, more than a century ago before fire suppression. So one type, of course, is wildland fire, basically wildfires from lightning strikes. We need more managed wildfire. We need to let more of those lightning strikes burn in more remote forests where it's safely, further away from homes. Another one, which the question, asked about, was prescribed fire. Prescribed fire is really kind of mostly low intensity fire that's purposefully set, usually as sort of a part of a fire management strategy. And that can have its time and place. I don't think it's a good idea at the landscape scale, because it really doesn't stop wildfires, and you'd have to just do it every few years and you'd kill a lot more trees. But it can be useful as an additional buffer around communities when it's done during very low fire weather and when there's really no chance for the fire to escape. But the last one, of course, is Native American cultural burning. And Native American tribes have been doing cultural burning for many thousands of years. And for subsistence, for religious purposes, for a host of reasons. And there's far less Native American cultural burning now than there was historically, for a lot of societal reasons. And a lot of it has to do with impediments that are placed, barriers to cultural burning by various agencies. I think we should reduce and remove a lot of those barriers, and I think we should facilitate more ease for tribes to do cultural burning. But those things are all about fire, and fire has a lot of benefits, which I'll get to in the second half. But we need to have totally separate conversations about that than logging, because logging is not a fire management strategy, and it's causing a lot of habitat damage.
Two more questions, Chad. One was early on in your discussion. How can fire intensity be high with low or zero biomass? Could you kind of explain that in a nutshell? Yeah,
no, this is a great question, and it's a very, very important thing to understand. I think it'll make sense once I explain. And I think the way that the person who asked the question asked it is really useful, because think about it this way. If you think about the different types of ecosystems where wildfire is a natural part, fire adapted ecosystems, you've got forests on the one hand, you've got woodlands, and you've got chaparral, and then you've got grasslands. basically what the data show is that fires spread most rapidly by far through grasslands than they do through forests, even though there's vastly more biomass in a forest. And it really comes down to the type of vegetation that can actually burn. So in a forest, what actually gets consumed, the only thing that gets consumed is basically dry grasses, dry leaves, pine needles on the forest floor, seedlings, really little tiny seedlings in the understory. The outer bark of the mature trees can certainly get charred. Trees can survive, trees can get killed, but they don't really get consumed. The pine needles can get consumed if it burns more intensely on the trees, but the trees themselves don't get consumed. Even their branches don't get consumed. And so it's important to understand that, because it's really the small stuff, the flashy material, grasses and seedlings, that actually carry flames and that are more combustible. If you think of it like kindling in a sense. And so one perfect example of this, oh, by the way, so in forest fires, they move very slowly, much more slowly than most people think. Even a very fast moving forest fire, that's about 1 mile per hour. And that doesn't happen that often. And even then it's going to not go on that fast for very long. Most of even the biggest forest fires, on average, over the course of the 2 or 3 months that they burn, they're moving at about 1/20th, 1/50th of a mile per hour, a tiny fraction of 1 mile per hour on average. And they'll move faster for short bursts, 1-2 miles per hour sometimes, but very, very rarely do they move that fast, and only for short periods of time. A grass fire, in stark contrast, a grass fire can move 7, 8, 10 miles per hour, even over 10 miles per hour when they're wind driven. And we saw tragically the results of that in Colorado just weeks ago, as a grass fire called the Marshall Fire burned near Boulder, but not in the mountains, not in the forest. It was about 9 miles from the nearest forest. This was all grassland, high plains, and we saw over 1,000 homes were burned. And so, and that fire moved very, very rapidly compared to what a forest fire will do. And so that underscores the fact that protecting communities from wildfire is not a forest community issue. It's also about what happens in the foothills and the grasslands and the valleys. But also it explains why, or underscores why, it's not about biomass. It's not about more biomass driving flames. In fact, it's exactly the opposite, because ecosystems with less biomass have more grasses and fine material that can carry flames quickly. And they have no windbreak effect from those trees.
Final question, Chad. How is fire intensity measured?
Yeah, good question. So I purposefully use the term fire intensity because, especially when I'm talking to non-scientists or a group of people with different types of backgrounds, because the term intensity is value neutral, and there's a lot of terms in wildfire that have they're pejorative and actually lead to bad policies, like catastrophic wildfire and things like that. That technically the term intensity pertains to the energy release from fire, and the energy release can be thought of as basically the heat released by the fire. High intensity releases more energy. It's hotter, higher flames. Lots of different ways that's measured. One of the key metrics is rate of spread. Another one is flame length and flame height. But the other one is called fire severity. And fire severity, I don't really like the term severity, but technically what that means is it's a percentage of the above ground vegetation that's killed. And so in a forest, for example, the typical definition is if 75% or more of the trees are killed, that's a high intensity fire patch.
That's the end of the questions for now, Chad.
All right. Well, thanks. Great questions. All right, so I'm going to go to the second half here, which is really all about the ecology of fire in forests. And I'm going to address what I call the catastrophic wildfire myth. And it's basically, and I'm sure you all have heard many, many times different versions of this narrative. The narrative goes something like this. Because the forests are overgrown, because there's too many trees, because of fire suppression and those pesky environmental laws and those pesky environmentalists that are protecting our forests and preventing us from getting in there with chainsaws and bulldozers. Because of all that, the fires are burning way too big, way too hot. They're sterilizing the soil, nothing will grow. They're mostly burning at high intensity, et cetera. They're destroying the forests, they're destroying wildlife habitat. That's what we're hearing over and over and over again, like a drumbeat every single fire season. So I'm going to talk about what the science is really telling us on that. First of all, even the largest fires, doesn't matter how big they are, the largest fires are mostly low and moderate intensity. In other words, mostly the fires burn in ways that where most of the trees survive. They remain green, they survive, they get partially scorched. Maybe seedlings and saplings may die. Some mature trees may die, but most of the mature trees survive in those low and moderate intensity areas. And only a portion burns at high intensity, typically in that range of 20 to 30%, oftentimes less than 20% burns at high intensity. And this is a fire intensity map of the Rim Fire, which I've been studying since it burned in 2013 in the Sierra Nevada. It's a 257,000 acre fire, big fire. And the green and yellow areas are the low and moderate intensity areas where most of the trees survive and remain green. The red areas are the high intensity fire patches where most of the trees, not all in every case, but most of the trees are killed, and all of the trees in some areas. Those are the red areas. Now it's interesting because when I give presentations on this, I'll often ask people to, in their minds, estimate what percentage of the total fire those red areas comprise. And I can tell you just from experience that most of the time when people look at those red areas, they think it's, maybe 30, 40% of the fire, something like that, at least 25. It's actually 19.9% of the fire. High intensity fire was only 19.9%. That's what that red is. But the thing is about that bright, shocking color red, which they always use for high intensity fire, is it draws the eye. It looks more like it's more than it is. And so it's another type of bias, basically the color coding in the fire intensity maps. But the bottom line is that no matter how big the fire is, it's mostly low and moderate. This is the Wallow Fire that happened in 2011 in eastern Arizona, 565,000 acre fire. And it was about, I believe this was 9% high intensity, those red areas. And the rest, of course, the light green, the dark green, and the yellow, that's the low and moderate. That made up over 90% of the fire. And it was a fire that was over 500,000 acres in size. And this is typical. And so this idea, this notion that if a fire is bigger, it's going to be more intense, it doesn't work that way. In fact, oftentimes the bigger fires are less intense on average. Now, interestingly, historically, before fire suppression, high intensity fire was a natural component of the fire regimes in these forests, including Ponderosa pine, Jeffrey pine, and mixed conifer forests. And it typically comprised anywhere from 20 to 35% of any given fire on average, but it could be much higher or lower in any individual fire. But at the landscape scale over meaningful timeframes, typically 20 or 35% was pretty common. And there's lots of research on that now, and I've got some of those studies cited in the bottom of the slide. And interestingly, we did years of research on this, went to the National Archives in San Bruno and spent long hours researching these historical forest surveys that were done around 1911. And it turns out that, and they were done by the early US Forest Service. And we found that there was a series of US Forest Service studies that claimed using these same data sets, at least supposedly, they claimed that the forests were very open and park-like historically, and the tree density was much, much lower. What we found is they actually left out most of the data, especially and including the data on small trees. And they, when we included all those data, it turns out the historical forests were 17 times denser in terms of trees per acre than they reported for Ponderosa pine forest types, and they were 7 times denser than they reported in mixed conifer forest types historically. So the idea that the forests were all open and park-like historically is also another piece of misinformation. Certainly there were open forests, but there were also very, very dense forests. It was very heterogeneous, very mixed. and so is fire. This is a map that was done by early US Geological Survey researchers, and I spent years researching this as well. These folks traveled the northern Sierra Nevada and surveyed every 40-acre section extensively. It took them about 9 years, late 1800s. And this is a map that was one of the maps that was created by them. And those white polygons that have the cross hatching, those are high intensity fire patches that occurred at some point between 1800 and 1890 or 1900, basically the 1800s, that century. And you can see from the kilometer scale on the bottom, some of these are very large. Some of these are thousands of acres in size. Some of them are even tens of thousands of acres in size. And outside of that, you have low and moderate intensity fire. But point is that high intensity fire was a natural part of the mix. Many of the patches were small historically, some of them were large. And this is just a quote from these, just one of many similar quotes from these US Geological Survey researchers, where they were just describing the forest conditions that they were mapping. And they were talking about how there's these dense stands of old forest that got lightly burned right next to stands of mature forest that burned hot, where you've got mostly standing dead trees. You've got the chaparral, you've got the regenerating young trees coming up through the chaparral. It's really that mix. That's a natural mix in these forests. You need those different types of habitat, and I'll talk about why that is in a minute. The main reason is that these areas that burn at high intensity, that 20 or 30% typically in a big fire that burns at high intensity, we call that snag forest habitat. Those high intensity fire patches don't destroy or eliminate habitat. They actually create habitat. It turns out that snag forest habitat that's created by high intensity fire is comparable to old growth forest in terms of native biodiversity and wildlife abundance. And in fact, there are many different wildlife species and plant species that have evolved over countless millennia to depend on snag forest habitat. And that's where they're found primarily. And you find them rarely or not at all in other forest habitat types, including low intensity fire patches, where most of the trees are alive. Lots of species like that, but some like it hot. And I'll talk about some of those in a minute. But structurally, snag forest habitat is incredibly complex. It's a mix of standing dead trees, which are snags, down logs after the snags fall, naturally regenerating conifers and oaks and dogwoods and shrubs, wildflowers. It is a very rich and complex ecosystem. I took this picture at 12 years post-fire in a high-intensity fire patch. The Forest Service, right after the fire, they said that the forest could not naturally regenerate because they said it's not possible in high-intensity fire patches for natural regeneration to occur because there's no live tree seed source. And they proposed to clear cut this area and spray herbicides and artificially plant tree plantations. We stopped them from doing that on this particular location, and we got to see what nature could actually do. And what we found, like so many other areas, is that the forests don't need to be planted after fires. They don't need any intervention from us. They do what they've been doing for millions and millions of years. And this habitat is remarkable, in those shrub patches in the understory and those dense pockets of natural forest regeneration. It's great habitat, including the down logs as well. Great habitat for small mammals. Lots of different types of small mammals, including pocket gophers and deer mice and different species of rabbits and hare. And in fact, the small mammal prey biomass in the understory of a snag forest patch is between 2 and 6 times higher than it is in an unburned old forest. And that provides a lot of food for raptors and imperiled predators like the Pacific fisher, for example. And because so many of the understory plants in snag forest are flowering plants, wildflowers and flowering shrubs, that attracts and provides habitat for a lot of native flying insects. And those native flying insects, in turn, provide food for fly-catching birds and bats. And so there are many different species of bats and fly-catching birds that are primarily associated with snag forest habitat, and they reach their highest abundances in the snag forest. as well as many shrub nesting birds and ground nesting birds, because they get great habitat in those the shrubs that germinate after intense fire. We call that montane chaparral. And of course, the woodpeckers love the snag forest. And the reason the woodpeckers love it is that when fires occur, especially in those patches that burn hot, they send up smoke, they send up heat. And that attracts dozens of different native species of wood-boring beetles. These are native species that have evolved to depend not just on fire and post-fire habitat, but specifically on recently fire-killed trees, and especially patches of recently fire-killed trees. And they depend on recently fire-killed trees for reproduction. And so these beetles, they're big, they will fly right to the fire, and they'll land right after the flames have passed and the fire-killed trees have cooled. They lay their eggs on the charred bark of fire-killed trees, and the larvae develop and bore through the charred wood into through the charred bark into the wood of the tree. And they develop there over time and emerge later as adults, and then go through another cycle in those dead trees until they have to find another fire. But while they're in those trees, those snags, in their larval phase, that's the primary food source for many different native woodpecker species that have evolved to depend on the larvae of the wood-boring beetles. One of those I've been studying for almost 2 decades now. It's called the black-backed woodpecker. And you can see the picture of a black-backed woodpecker here with a wood-boring beetle larva, a grub in its mouth, its beak. Bark beetles, by the way, also their larvae are also important habitat, important food for woodpeckers, for different woodpecker species. But the ones that really are associated with fire areas, they like the wood-boring beetles. And of course, dead trees are softer than live trees. And because they're softer, the woodpeckers can more easily excavate nest cavities into the dead trees. And so, for example, one pair of black-backed woodpeckers will create 2 to 4 new nest cavities every single year. And then they pick the one they like the best, and that's where they raise their young. But all the cavities they create every year that they don't use, those are available to all the other cavity nesting species in the forest that have to have nest cavities to raise their young, but cannot create their own. They rely on the woodpeckers to do that. Bluebirds, nuthatches, flying squirrels, chipmunks, dozens and dozens of bird and small mammal species need the woodpeckers to create cavities for them. Now, the woodpeckers can only do that if you've got dead trees that are softer than live trees, and if you've got dead trees that have a lot of the food for them in the form of the wood-boring beetles. And the wood-boring beetles and their larvae, they can only survive and reproduce if you have fire-killing patches of trees. And so this is a very complex and interconnected cycle that is creating habitat, creating the ecological richness and biodiversity. Now, black-backed woodpeckers and other woodpecker species that are strongly associated with snag forest, they're mostly black on their backs. The black-backed woodpecker is entirely black on its back. And of course, that's a natural camouflage that they evolved. That's just one of the advantages that they have in snag forests that they do not have in low intensity fire areas. I was standing about 25 feet from a female black-backed woodpecker when I took this picture. Take a look at that snag in the center of the image and see if you can find her. The tip of the arrow is touching the top of her head. And it just shows you, again, I'm only 25 feet away from her when I took this picture. Oftentimes they'll just stop their foraging. They won't vocalize. They'll just wait for you to pass. And if they don't move or vocalize, they're basically invisible. That's how perfect their camouflage is in the snag forest, how perfectly adapted they are to this habitat type. And this is a male black-backed woodpecker feeding a male chick. And it's a little easier to see because the bark had actually flaked off of this tree. This was several years after the fire, so the bark was already gone. But they're just really interesting animals and strong excavators and what we call keystone species in the forest because they create homes and habitat for so many other wildlife species. Now, interestingly, there's lots of research on this, and I've discussed a lot of it in my book, Smokescreen. But there are now stacks and stacks of scientific studies that find that Snag forest habitat is incredibly biodiverse, and oftentimes you find the highest levels of bird abundance and species richness in the snag forest. Now, again, you don't want everything to be snag forest because we know there are plenty of species that like low and moderate intensity burn areas as well. But you want the mix. The mix is ecologically healthy. You want the low, you want the moderate, and you want the high. Now, I published a study with a couple of my colleagues a few years back about what happens to California spotted owls, a rare and imperiled species, and we have them here in the Southern California mountains. What happens to them when post-fire logging occurs? It turns out that California spotted owls really benefit from patches of snag forest because they hunt and forage in those patches because the small mammal prey base is so great. They nest and roost primarily in the low and moderate intensity areas, but they go out of their way to forage in the snag forest. And when post-fire logging occurs in those snag forest patches, which is where post-fire logging occurs mostly, they really target the snag forest. What you find is that spotted owl populations plummet. Basically, you're taking away their preferred hunting grounds, and you're taking away their food. Now, as I mentioned before, overall, we have less wildland fire in this country now than we had historically. That's especially true in forests. It's not true in every vegetation type. There are some high desert ecosystems that have too much fire. Mostly that's because of invasive grasses and human ignitions. And Southern California chaparral has too much fire, mostly because of human ignitions. And so we need to find ways to curb those human ignitions so that we do not have too much fire in those ecosystems. But in forests, we still have a deficit. And interestingly, this question comes up a lot. Even in high intensity fire patches, only about 3% or less of the tree carbon is actually consumed. Even if the fire kills 100% of the trees, only a small percentage of the tree carbon is consumed and emitted. And for that reason, all of the models that we hear reported every single fire season, they're vastly overstating the amount of carbon emissions from wildfire because they're all based upon faulty assumptions that fire consumes 30% or 10%, or in some cases 50% of the tree biomass, which is not true. It's usually less than 3%. The other thing is that the models do not account for post-fire forest regrowth. They basically assume there's no regeneration. And so they don't account for post-fire carbon sequestration, which is incredibly vigorous and rapid after fire and accelerates with every year post-fire as the regrowth matures. And this is me and climate scientist, Dr. James Hansen. Well, we have teamed up to fight a large post-fire logging project on the Stanislaus National Forest in the Rim Fire. And we're in court right now against the U.S. Forest Service, which is clear cutting these snag forests and hauling the trees and the young forests down to biomass energy facilities in the foothills in the Central Valley, and they're incinerating the trees for energy production. Now, some of you may have heard this, but burning trees for energy actually emits even more carbon than burning coal for equal energy produced. It's even worse than coal from a climate change standpoint. So it's a real climate change nightmare, but the Forest Service is doing this project based upon the claim that the high intensity fire patches will not naturally regenerate, that there's no natural regeneration. As you can see, Dr. Hansen, the other Dr. Hansen and I are standing in natural regeneration. This is at just 8 years post-fire. It's already well over the tops of our heads. And there was no planting here. This is all natural. This is typical. In the Rim Fire now, in these high intensity fire patches, oftentimes it's over 12 feet tall now already, just at less than 9 years post-fire, just a little over 8 years post-fire. This is Dr. Hansen and I standing in right next to where that other picture was taken, but this area was post-fire logged several years earlier and planted under the guise of fuel reduction, restoration, and reforestation. Those terms sound benign, they sound benevolent, but that's what this really looks like. And basically what you have is a stump field. The trees they planted mostly died. There's very little that survived because they did so much damage with the logging equipment, and they removed the nutrients, they compacted the soils. And the logging machinery brings in and spreads invasive combustible grasses like cheatgrass. And so most of the ground is covered by cheatgrass now, which is not a native species. This is another area, a typical area, high intensity fire patch in the rimfire. This is right in the middle of one of the largest high intensity fire patches in the rimfire. I took this picture last year. This is at 8 years post-fire. And it's hard to get a sense of scale here, but this area is more than 1,000 feet away from the nearest live surviving tree in any direction. And yet, look at all this natural forest regeneration. These conifer saplings are over 12 feet tall. Some of them are 14 feet tall already. And there are hundreds of them per acre. No planting, no anything. This is all natural regeneration. Right next door, where post-fire logging occurred several years earlier, you've got stump fields and cheatgrass and almost no surviving trees, even after they've planted. Now, sometimes the planted trees mostly survive. Sometimes nearly all of them die. But the point is that they're doing a lot of damage. They're removing a lot of carbon and putting it into the atmosphere, and they're destroying wildlife habitat. And the thing is, the forests don't need our help after fire. They regenerate wonderfully, just like they've been doing for over 300 million years after fires. Interestingly, I've got a study in peer review right now on giant sequoias in high intensity fire patches. And it turns out giant sequoias regenerate best by far in high intensity fire patches. These right in the center of the image there, that's dozens of giant sequoia seedlings and saplings. Many of those are over 5 feet tall. At 4 years post-fire in the railroad fire in the Nelder Grove. And further into the fire, there's a low intensity fire patch. And this is just a typical picture. The fire burned, just crept along the forest floor, killed some seedlings. That's about it. All the mature trees survived. The flames never got above maybe 1 foot in height. And there's no giant sequoia regeneration here. It's essentially absent. Giant sequoias need fire that has some significant intensity in order to melt the resins in the cones and release the seeds. And it needs fire of a sufficient intensity to consume the thick duff and litter on the forest floor and turn it into a nutrient-rich bed of mineral ash that spurs and enhances the growth of the forest for many decades to come. In addition, when fire is more intense and it kills most of the canopy trees, it actually allows the giant sequoia seedlings the amount of sunlight they need to thrive and grow. And so when you get these more intense fire patches, it's going to kill some mature giant sequoias, but you will get vastly more sequoias in the bargain. These groves have been slowly dying off for over a century because of fire exclusion and with little fanfare. If you go into these groves, you'll see, a small number of mature ones and essentially no young sequoias. But after fire, you've got hundreds per acre. It's amazing. Now, the question is, well, what about Southern California forests? I've talked a lot about the Sierra Nevada, but what about the forest down here? Is it different somehow? And the answer is no. We see the same lessons. This is a picture that was taken in the 1930s of a large high-intensity fire patch in Big Pine Mountain in the Los Padres National Forest in Southern California. We've always had a mix of low, moderate, and high-intensity fire. We've got lots of photographic evidence of that. And interestingly, in our forests down here, as in elsewhere in the West, especially in forests that are pine dominated, which is very common, Jeffrey pine or Ponderosa pine, for example, forests that look dead initially are often not. So on the upper left there, that's a picture that I took. Just months after the lake fire occurred in 2015. This is right on the edge of the San Gorgonio Wilderness at the trailhead going into Fish Creek, into the Aspen Grove. I took this right at the trailhead at the little parking area there. And this area, those trees they all look dead. You can't see any green needles. And look at the lower right. That I took 1 year later. That's after what I call flushing occurred. I actually published the first paper on this back in 2009. What happens is the fire, the heat from the fire will kill the needles. And so they're brown and the needles are dead. But the buds at the end of the branches have protective coatings around them, and they don't get killed. They actually survive. And a year or maybe a little over a year after the fire, they produce new green needles, and you've got a whole new green crown from a tree that for a whole year or more looked completely dead. In many cases, they're cutting these trees down because they are claiming they're dead, and they're trying to justify cutting them down for various reasons. And I've been telling the Forest Service, now wait a minute, most of these trees are alive, hold off with those chainsaws and bulldozers. And this is a close-up picture to show what it looks like. This is flushing in an early stage at the first year post-fire. This is a Ponderosa Pine. And again, tree had not a single green needle on it after the fire. And you can see all these new thousands and thousands of new green needles coming in from the surviving buds 1 year later. Amazing. And most of the trees that flush do survive long-term. Some will flush and die, but that's a fairly small percentage. But the other thing that's important to understand is that just like in the forests in the Sierra Nevada or the Rocky Mountain, Ponderosa Pine, Douglas fir forests, and other mixed conifer and Ponderosa Pine forests in the West, like Southwest, when fires occur, they're mostly low and moderate intensity, even the big fires. And there's a portion that's high intensity. But it's important to realize that most of the whole area that burns in a given fire looks like this. This is a picture that I took of the mountain fire that burned in 2013 in the San Jacinto Mountains. And most of the fire looks just like this. In fact, people could hike through for miles and miles and not even realize they were in a fire area because the flames were so low and the fire just crept along and it killed so few trees. If you look carefully, you can see the char at the base of the trees, but it often doesn't go up more than 8 inches up the bottom of the tree. And so, oftentimes people don't even realize they're in fire areas. Now, as I mentioned before, spotted owls love to nest and roost in the low and moderate intensity areas, but they go out of their way to forage in the high intensity areas. And we call this the bed and breakfast effect. And there's a great example of this in the Lake Fire, which is only several miles from where my wife and I live here in the Big Bear area. And so we've spent a lot of time in the Lake Fire, which burned in the San Gorgonio Wilderness in 2015. This is a pair of California spotted owls that was actually just outside of the fire area. They were just west of where the fire occurred. But in the year after the fire, they moved east and they reestablished a new nest territory inside the fire area, right on the edge of a large high intensity fire patch. And they've been successfully reproducing ever since. And you can see 2 chicks there that successfully fledged in the first year post-fire. And the reason for that is they've got the perfect mix of habitats, and they've got plenty of food from that snag forest habitat patch that's just outside their front porch. And just like in the Sierra Nevada, the woodpeckers love the snags, and they drill through the charred bark of these fire-killed trees to get the larvae of the wood-boring beetles. And that's what you can see here. It kind of looks like someone sat there with a rifle and shot up the tree. And that's actually the woodpeckers foraging for those beetle larvae. That's what it looks like. And just to give you some perspective, the woodpeckers, one woodpecker will eat thousands and thousands of these wood-boring beetle larvae every single year. The blackback woodpecker, which doesn't live in the Southern California mountains, but its cousins do, hairy woodpeckers and white-headed woodpeckers are, in a sense, evolutionary cousins, and they really like the snag forest. They eat the wood-boring beetle larvae too. They really depend on them pretty heavily. But the blackbacks, just to put in perspective, one blackback woodpecker eats 13,500 wood-boring beetle larvae every single year. That's how much it needs. When the lake fire occurred, I got all these frantic calls from concerned members of the public, from environmental reporters, asking about the Aspen Grove in Fish Creek. It's a beloved grove, and I'm sure many of you know it and have hiked it. That area actually burned the most intensely of any area in the lake fire. It was a large, high-intensity fire patch. And I got all these calls, and people said, "No, oh my gosh, it's going to kill the aspens. We won't be able to see the aspens again." And I said, well, here's what's going to happen, because we know this from lots of other fires. Aspen depend on high-intensity fire for effective reproduction. that aspen grove was slowly dying off because it wasn't getting much sunlight. And there was a mature forest that had developed and grown around it since the last intense fire occurred way back in the 1800s. After the lake fire occurred, the aspen grove has thrived and flourished. It has even more area now than it had before the fire, and there's vastly more stems, aspen stems, than there were before. It's already about half the height that it was before the fire in just several years after the fire occurred. Remarkable. That's me standing in the middle of the aspen grove after the fire, all the natural aspen regeneration. And that was a couple of years ago that my wife took that picture. It's much taller now. And we see the same thing with regard to post-fire conifer regeneration. Jeffrey pine and white fir and incense cedar, all the native conifer species, they naturally regenerate just wonderfully in these high-intensity fire patches. This is natural regeneration in a high-intensity fire patch in the mountain fire, which I mentioned earlier, burned in 2013 in the San Jacinto Mountains. And there's dozens of naturally regenerating conifer seedlings and saplings per acre, even more than the pre-fire tree density, interestingly. In this area, there was 73 seedlings and saplings per acre naturally regenerating, and the pre-fire density was 51 trees per acre. Similar thing in the lower elevation part of the mountain fire in the May Valley area on the San Bernardino National Forest. The post-fire regeneration was 29 per acre. The pre-fire tree density was 16 per acre. Now, I'll just wrap up here in a moment, but I wanted to mention that, over 200 climate scientists and ecologists recently told Congress that in order to overcome the climate crisis, we have to protect our forests a whole lot more. And that means we're going to have to protect more forests from logging, and we're going to have to start transitioning away from wood products and reducing our wood consumption and shifting to a lot of really good alternatives to wood for paper, for building materials. There's lots of great alternatives that have much lower carbon footprints and are much better for the environment. So if anyone's interested, I can certainly send you a copy of the letter if you contact me directly later. And I will just wrap it up there, and we'll be happy to answer any more questions. I'll stop screen sharing now.
Chad, we have a whole host of questions, so I want to start off here. What was the intensity of the recent Sequoia National Park fire?
Yeah, great question. So that fire is called the KNP complex, and that burned last year. It's a lightning fire, natural lightning fire. And it is a classic mixed intensity fire, very natural. It's mostly low and moderate intensity. Right now, it appears that it's at least 80% low and moderate intensity. We'll get the final fire intensity data probably later this summer, but we have the initial preliminary stuff, which often gets tweaked and modified later. But it looks like at least 80%, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's closer to 80, 85% was low and moderate intensity. There was some high intensity fire. Some of that occurred mostly in the Sequoia groves. It burned at low and moderate intensity, where of course the mature Sequoias survive, and most of the other conifer trees survive as well. There was some high intensity fire, and there was a little bit of that in some of the Sequoia groves, but that's where you're going to get the best giant Sequoia regeneration. And so it's one of these things that's just a cycle of life. In order to reproduce effectively, you need fire in certain places that's going to burn hot enough that it will kill some of the mature Sequoias. So there will be some that were killed, but far fewer than the Park Service has told the public. The problem is that the Park Service, and they issued a press release a couple months back, estimating a certain percentage of the Sequoias were killed. Those percentages are inflated, both in the KNP complex fire and in the Castle fire that burned the year earlier further south. And the reason is that they're assuming that every area that's mapped as high intensity was essentially 100% mortality of Sequoias or close to it. And that's not true at all. Most of those areas that are mapped as high intensity, many of them are actually moderate intensity because of the flushing thing that I described earlier. Lots of different conifers flush, including giant Sequoias, but also the pines. And so a lot of the areas that look dead to the satellite imagery are not. And so they're overstating how much high intensity fire occurred.
Okay, next question is about the color coding that you were mentioning. Questioner asks or states, interesting color coding and how it biases opinion. Which color would be ideal for natural fire cycles as happened prior to Forest Service intervention and fire suppression?
That's a great question. You know, I played around this a little bit in different fire intensity maps. I guess I kind of like the idea of just not using red at all. You know, red is in our society, red means caution. It means danger. It means bad. It means stop, go back. It means negative things typically, especially that kind of bright, shocking red they use for high intensity fire. It's a way to subtly and almost subliminally devalue these areas and distract attention, distract people's attention away from the incredible habitat value. You know, it's interesting, these snag forest areas that burn at high intensity, so long as post-fire logging doesn't occur, if they're just naturally regenerate, it's actually some of the greenest place, it's like the greenest place on the entire landscape after a few years after the fire. So I would say, we should probably experiment with other colors, no reds, probably not even use yellow, use different shades of green. That's one thing I've done, is use light, medium, and dark green, things like that. I've used different shades of blue as well, but just something that doesn't mislead the eye.
The next question: what is your opinion of patchwork forest thinning and logging?
Not a fan. So whether you're clear cutting or whether you're doing commercial thinning operations, logging has an impact. It has a significant adverse impact. You've got a climate change impact, because whenever you remove a tree from the forest, a lot of people don't realize this, but over 2/3 of the carbon in that tree ends up in the atmosphere almost immediately. Only a small percentage, typically less than 20% of the wood in that tree, and at most maybe 30%, is going to end up in a lumber product somewhere. Mostly the branches and the treetops, which can be a large, substantial percentage of the carbon in the tree, that gets incinerated at these biomass plants typically these days, and that carbon goes into the atmosphere. That can be anywhere from 20 to 40% of the carbon in the tree. Then the actual log is brought to the timber mill, and they mill it. And of course, the bark, which can be 18% of the carbon in the tree, is incinerated at the timber mill for energy. And the sawdust, where all the saw blades go through, the round parts, they can't be used for lumber, and of course the saw blades have a certain thickness. At the end of the day, you end up with a very small amount, really, that ends up in a lumber product. And so logging in this country, and this is something, we just had another letter from over 200 climate scientists and ecologists we sent to Congress, and we informed them that logging in this country now produces as much annual CO2 as burning coal in the US. It's now comparable to burning coal. That's how big the climate change impact of logging is in this country. And just to put in perspective, when you're looking at commercial thinning in particular, forget about clear cutting for the moment, which is even worse, but look at commercial thinning. What the research shows is it emits 3 times more carbon per acre than wildfire alone with no thinning. And so there's serious climate change impacts. Of course, there's biodiversity impacts, as I talked about. But the other thing is that it doesn't stop wildfires. And it often makes them burn hotter and faster toward towns. And so what I believe, and what many of my colleagues believe, is that we need to protect our forests. We need to get the US Forest Service out of the commercial logging business and fully protect our national forests from commercial logging. And we need to redirect all those logging subsidies into a jobs program to help create fire-safe communities, to help homeowners, especially the ones that can't afford it, to do the defensible space and the home hardening, so we can save homes and save lives.
Okay, next question. How important are bark beetles for the ecosystem? Is there ever a time that bark beetles can be too invasive? Should bark beetles be mitigated or removed?
Great question. And again, I've got a lot more information in my book Smokescreen about the bark beetles and the wood boring beetles. But here's the short answer. in ecology, you want things to be within the natural range of variability. So just because snagged forest is good habitat doesn't mean you couldn't theoretically have too much of it. You also can have too little of it. So you don't want too much or too little. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that we actually have less snagged forests now than we had historically before fire suppression. In our forests, there's lots of different studies that have reconstructed historical habitat heterogeneity, how much snagged forest there was versus middle-aged forest versus late successional old growth forest at any given point in time. And snagged forest created by high-intensity fire patches or more rarely by pockets of high-intensity tree mortality from drought and bark beetles. Sometimes bark beetles can kill the majority of trees in a stand too. Doesn't happen as often as fire, but it can happen. And so from that combination, any type of natural process that creates snag forest, historically, snag forest was typically between 20 and 30% of the forest, of the area in any given forest ecosystem. Right now, it's less than 10% in most of our forests. In some areas, because of some recent fires and also that recent drought and the tree mortality from the drought in the southwestern Sierra Nevada, in some areas it's between 12 and 15%, but it's still less than it was historically. So we don't want it to be 50 or 60%. That would be unnatural for snag forest to be 60% of the forested landscape. But we also shouldn't worry or lament it if it goes from 10% up to 15 or 20% when we understand that historically 20 to 30% was natural. And so that's a long way of saying you want the bark beetles, you want the wood-boring beetles. These are all native beetle species. You don't want too little, you don't want too much. But right now we still don't have too much. We're still a little bit in a deficit situation. And in many ways, the larvae of those bark beetles and the larvae of the wood-boring beetles, they're the cornerstone of the entire ecosystem. Because without the droughts or the fires that kill patches of trees, you can't have the beetles. They can't reproduce. And without the beetles, you can't have the woodpeckers because they've got no food and they've got no trees to excavate nest cavities in. If you lose the woodpeckers, then you don't have any bluebirds or nuthatches or flying squirrels or chipmunks. They don't have the habitat because the woodpeckers aren't there to create the nest cavities. And then, of course, you don't have food for Cooper's hawks and goshawks and other raptors. And so this is an intricate, complex, beautiful, interconnected ecosystem. But in many ways, it's the whole thing is predicated upon these natural cycles of life and death. And the bark beetles are right in the center of that.
Speaking of the woodpeckers, next question is, what is the habit for black-backed woodpeckers? I think you answered the part B of the question, but the question was, if not local to SoCal, is there an equivalent in our area? But I think state habitat.
Yeah. So in the Sierra Nevada and in the Rocky Mountains and in the boreal forests of Canada, where black-backed woodpeckers live, they live all the way down to the black-backed woodpeckers go as south as the southern Sierra Nevada, just north of Lake Isabella. Black-backed woodpeckers, one pair of blackbacks needs about 200 or 300 acres of forest, mature, dense forest that burns at moderate and high intensity mostly. That's really what they need. They need pretty big patches of higher intensity fire. And they're related species. They're also in the same genus, Sequoias, like the hairy woodpecker and the white-headed woodpecker that live in the Sierra Nevada, but they also live in the Southern California forest. And in fact, the white-headed woodpeckers we have down here in Southern California mountains is a genetically distinct subspecies. So we have our own unique white-headed woodpecker, and they really do like the moderate and high-intensity fire patches because, of course, that's where the most food is for the woodpeckers. They'll eat the wood-boring beetles. They will also eat bark beetle larvae. The white-headeds and hairy woodpeckers still eat generally more wood-boring beetle larvae than anything else, but they do have a substantial portion that can be bark beetle larvae as well, more so than blackbacks, which are really much more heavily focused on the wood-boring beetle larvae.
Next question, also a species question. What keystone species should we be watching for in our forest, the San Bernardino National Forest? So what keystone species are you seeing or would you recommend that we watch?
That's a great question. I would really focus on the woodpeckers in significant part. There are a lot of different species that are vulnerable in different ways. Not all of them are keystone species. I'm concerned, for example, about the flying squirrels. The San Bernardino flying squirrel. It's cavity nester. It needs those woodpecker cavities. Needs the dead trees. I think that there's concern about their potential rarity, especially as the Forest Service cuts more and more dead trees, thinking that they're doing something to reduce fire hazard, which that doesn't work that way. Dead trees are not a fire hazard. And so they're cutting a lot of the dead trees, and that of course harms the woodpeckers. It also harms flying squirrels. But the woodpeckers are definitely keystone species because they excavate so many nest cavities for other wildlife species in the forest. So I would focus a lot on the white-headed woodpecker and the hairy woodpecker, in my view.
Fascinating. Next one is about the cheatgrass you were talking about. Any way of characterizing the seeming natural suppression of cheatgrass in a non-logged area of severe intensity fire? What causes the natural suppression in these severe intensity fire areas that are non-logged?
Yeah, it's great question. So first of all, cheatgrass can be killed by high intensity fire, not low and moderate, but it can be killed by high intensity fire. So if there's cheatgrass that was brought in by logging equipment, 10 years earlier in an area, let's say it was a commercial thinning project, and logging often brings in cheatgrass, and then it burns in a wildfire, it can really knock the cheatgrass back if it burns intensely in that particular area. And the cool thing is that when the forest naturally regenerates, the shrubs, the oaks, the natural conifer regeneration, all of that vegetation cover that naturally comes in after fire and accelerates with every passing year after the fire occurs, it basically creates canopy cover. It doesn't have to be, canopy cover that's 80 feet tall. It can also be canopy cover that's just a few feet above the ground. Basically, it creates conditions that are just inhospitable for cheatgrass, because cheatgrass, above all, needs very, very high levels of sunlight. So it loves unnaturally disturbed ground, like churned up from the treads on logging machinery, on logging tractors. It needs very high levels of sunlight, and so it thrives in logged environments because many of the trees have been removed by the logging equipment and logging machinery and loggers, and so you have more sunlight. And then, of course, the logging machinery brings in the seed source of the cheatgrass, so it spreads the cheatgrass. But after fire, not only can it kill a lot of the cheatgrass if it burns more intensely, but in addition, you get all this rapid natural post-fire regeneration of all these native species that thrive after intense fire. And that basically creates conditions where the cheatgrass simply can't live because it has too much shade.
Flushing question.
Yeah.
With flushing, is there a way to tell if the trees are alive before the new buds come out?
No, not to my knowledge, anyway. If there is a way, I'm not aware of it, and I'm not aware of anyone who's aware of it. So I would say the answer is no. You really just don't know until well into the summer of the first year post-fire. I will say this: flushing is not rare. If the fire is true crown fire, so in other words, if the flames go all the way up to the tops of the trees, then that is a snag forest patch. Those are going to be fire-killed trees. But if the more common circumstance occurs where the flames get relatively high, but they don't go all the way up, they might go halfway up the tree, and they go high enough that the heat will kill the needles, then and you have the brown needles on the trees, right? If folks drove up and down Highway 38 after the El Dorado fire that occurred in the summer of 2020, you would have seen large portions of the hillside of the mountain where you just saw, brown needles. And it looked like, most or all the trees were dead. If you drive that same stretch now, because we have enough time that's passed since the fire, you will see that many of those areas are mostly live trees, and they've just had dramatic flushing of those areas. Sure, there's some snags here and there, but most of those areas where it looked like 80, 90, 100% tree mortality, it's mostly like 10, 20, 25% tree mortality.
Fascinating. Final question. There are many current efforts to reduce tree density to create more productive water retention in the Sierra snowpack for state water supply. Any opinion on these efforts of reducing tree density?
Yeah, so that those proposals are largely, if you really peel back the layers of the onion and you figure out where it's coming from, those proposals are largely coming from logging interests. And there are a lot of well-meaning people that have been misled by those proposals. The reality is this: some very, very expert hydrologists have looked in the data. It looked very closely at the data. There was a report maybe three and a half years ago by John Rhodes and Chris Frizzell. I'd be happy to send it to folks if they reach out. And in fact, I'll put my email address in the chat in case people want to get in touch. Anyway, what they found was this: that if you remove a bunch of trees from the forest, you will slightly increase the annual water yield runoff from the area. If, for example, you do a pretty intensive commercial thin. However, that slight increase over the course of the year comes almost entirely in the form of increased extreme flooding during the very time periods where you do not want more water coming down off the mountain into the foothill and valley communities. And so it does not give you more usable water yield. What it does is increase the chances of catastrophic flooding.
Well, that's it for now for our questions. Chad, fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
Well,
does
thank you all
anyone else?
so much.
Last call for questions. Okay, and thank you so much for a comprehensive. I know it's not comprehensive from your perspective, but it was just laden with facts and food for thought from our perspective. So thank you for your time. My pleasure. I'm happy to talk with you all anytime. And if I have lots of fact sheets and things that we write for, bite-sized chunks, with citations. If people want more information, feel free to reach out anytime. I'm happy to send along more information. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out to on that. As you probably have gathered, I find this issue endlessly fascinating. I always love talking about it. So really, it's been a pleasure talking with you all. Yes.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you, Chad.
And before everybody leaves, everybody's leaving. I just put in the chat a registration for our next event, which is just a week from tonight, about the 30 by 30 campaign. For those that might not be familiar, this is the plan announced by our governor and the president to conserve 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, with a goal of eventually getting to 50% by 2050. There is an opportunity for you to have a say in this and to take some action. So if you click on the link I just put in the chat, or email me, I'm happy to give you my email address. You can join our next event next Wednesday night, and thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marianne, for letting us know. That's a huge initiative. And there's a big you put a big write-up into the Palm and Pine.
Right, everyone on this should have received their Palm and Pine today,
right,
or yesterday. Today.
Yes.
Thank you. Yesterday, yes.
Right.
All right.
Well, thank you all, and I think that wraps it up for Trail Talk for this month. Next month is the wonderful photographer QT Luong on his brand new book, Our National Monuments, which is stunning, and it was fascinating to see when I was out on my hike at the Wildlands Preserve out in Whitewater. They had a copy of the book in their visitor center. So it's a beautiful text. So thank you all, and thank you, Chad Hansen, for a wonderful, educational, and thought-provoking talk about California and our local area.